It is very appropriate that I should be starting this video standing by a railway. Because I wanted to talk about so-called parliamentary trains, sometimes also affectionately referred to as ghost trains. Side note, although I'm filming it after dark, these trains are not really spooky as such, I don't know, but anyway, the majority of the ones I'll mention are not really spooky as such. A lot of rail enthusiasts will be familiar with the words parliamentary train because they're used to describe railway routes that are just being used to keep a route technically open. Routes like Stockport to Stalybridge via Denton, or West Ealing to High Wycombe, or Chester to Runcorn, or as if you've seen my channel, Streatham Hill to London Bridge via Tops Hill. But where does the name come from? Well, before I explain that, let me first get in the warm. It's freezing cold. Phew, that's better. To understand where the name parliamentary train comes from, we need to go back to the early to mid 19th century. Back then, railways were kind of a free-for-all. Specifically, a free-for-all to those so-called entrepreneurs building the lines. Because let's be honest, they weren't really interested in serving the general public. All they wanted to do was, well, for want of a better phrase, make a quick buck. And this quick buck often involved either constructing routes for short-term profit and not interested in the long term, or shadowing the path of other lines. The result, in 1844, was Parliament passing the Railway Regulation Act. The idea of this act was to force train companies to provide a cheap, then fast, railway for use by everybody. Because even though there were passenger trains before them, it was considered a luxury. But as it progressed, the general public got more and more interested in trains. And this is where the term parliamentary train begins. You see, part of the Railway Regulation Act 1844 was for companies to charge no more than an old penny a mile and run at least at 12 miles an hour. And companies were reluctant to do this because the truth is, economically, at the time, it was more profitable to move freight along the railway network than people. So as a result, passenger services were usually run once a day at infrequent times to legally say that they provide a service. But of course, the name gradually evolved as railways became ever more popular. Now you're probably thinking, what's that got to do with parliamentary trains today, Simon? Well, the modern day use of parliamentary trains is a legacy mostly from Dr. Richard Beeching. Because the general public at the time were so appalled by the sheer numbers coming out of the Reshaping of British Railways report in 1963 that they rose up and protested the closure of their railway, with varying degrees of success at best. And as a result, after that, government made it much harder to close railways down. And this is where the modern day use of the term comes in. You see, routes like the ones I mentioned earlier would, in earlier times, have been closed down. But because of the deliberately complicated and expensive process of calling for a public inquiry, examining the economic impact of closure, examining the social case, and all other things, including handing the notice of closure into public newspapers, some national, some local, and eventually handing it into the Office of Rail and Road, the reality is it's sometimes cheaper to run either an infrequent train service or have a permanent replacement bus. And so we have these weird situations, like one train a week calling it Reddish South and Denton, or one train using the Halton Curve linking the aforementioned Chester and Runcorn stations.